Sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones shouted through scandalous headlines or whispered behind closed doors. Sometimes the deadliest secrets live quietly in the hearts of those we trust the most, wearing the mask of love, of sacrifice, of legacy. But when death finally lifts that mask, what's revealed beneath can shatter everything we thought we knew. This is one of those stories. Enjoy the story. For as long as I can remember, my grandfather was more than just a man. He was a legend within our family. The kind of patriarch who commanded a room not with arrogance, but with a silent, overwhelming presence. His name was on buildings, on foundations, on business partnerships across multiple states. He didn't just build wealth, he built an identity, and that identity became the core of who we were. "We are Whitmores," he would say, as though the name itself carried a weight heavier than any title or fortune. I grew up in his shadow, listening to his stories, following him to charity galas, watching him shake hands with governors, CEOs, and foreign diplomats. He was the standard against which all of us measured ourselves, and truthfully, most of us failed. But that didn't matter, because he carried us all. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every graduation, every wedding, they were all somehow about him. And we were fine with that, because he was the protector, the unbreakable foundation beneath our feet, or so we thought. When he died, the world mourned him publicly. The obituaries called him a self-made visionary, a titan of industry, a man who turned dust into gold. His funeral was a grand affair, attended by politicians, celebrities, and business magnates. But beneath the polished eulogies and carefully rehearsed speeches, a different kind of tension simmered quietly within the family. Because behind closed doors, we all knew what was coming next, the reading of the will, and with it, the distribution of an empire. We gathered 2 days after the funeral in his private study, a room none of us dared enter when he was alive unless invited. The heavy oak doors closed behind us, and the silence felt suffocating. My parents, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, we all sat like well-dressed vultures, waiting for the lawyer to deliver what we assumed would be our birthright. The lawyer was a man named Gerald Brooks. He had served our family for decades, managing everything from business contracts to private trusts. He was loyal, discreet, and utterly devoid of emotion, exactly the kind of man my grandfather trusted with delicate matters. Gerald opened a thick leather-bound folder, clearing his throat. His voice was calm, clinical, as though he were reading a grocery list instead of dissecting a man's entire legacy. As stipulated in Mr. Whitmore's final will and testament, he began, "The estate shall be divided as follows." The initial sections were exactly what we expected. My father and uncles received majority ownership in the family's primary businesses. Properties were divided fairly, with clear instructions for long-term management. Trust funds were allocated to grandchildren. Educational scholarships were established for future generations. It was all orderly, predictable, precise, exactly how my grandfather conducted every aspect of his life. A faint sense of collective relief washed over the room. We exchanged polite nods, as if to say, "See? Nothing to worry about." But then, Gerald paused. His eyes briefly met mine, then shifted to the entire room. "There remains one final matter." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Every head lifted. The faint tension that had been lurking beneath our false smiles suddenly tightened, like a noose. "In addition to the primary estate," Gerald continued, "Mr. Whitmore maintained a series of private accounts and personal assets that were not included in the corporate holdings." My uncle leaned forward. "Private accounts?" Gerald nodded. "Yes. Over the last 15 years, Mr. Whitmore systematically transferred substantial personal assets into an independent trust. That trust, as of the date of his passing, holds a valuation exceeding $87 million. A collective gasp rippled through the room. My mother clutched my father's arm. My cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances. "87 million?" my aunt whispered. "In a separate trust?" Gerald continued, his voice unfazed. "This trust was entirely separate from his public portfolio. It includes cash holdings, private property, offshore investments, and multiple safe deposit accounts. My uncle's voice trembled as he demanded, "Who's the beneficiary?" Gerald took a slow breath, as though bracing for impact. "The sole beneficiary is a woman named Evelyn Harper." The name struck like a lightning bolt. Confusion erupted instantly. "Who the hell is Evelyn Harper?" my cousin barked. "She's not family," my aunt snapped. "We would know her." My father stood, his face pale. "Gerald, explain this. Is this a mistake? A clerical error?" Gerald shook his head firmly. "There is no error. All documents are legally binding. These transfers were initiated by Mr. Whitmore himself, in full legal capacity, over many years. Ms. Harper was fully authorized to receive these assets." The room exploded into overlapping voices, accusations, and frantic whispers. My uncles immediately jumped to assumptions. "She's a mistress, a blackmailer, a fraud." I sat in stunned silence, my mind spinning. Who was this woman? Why had my grandfather, a man who prized loyalty and family above all else, secretly funneled nearly $90 million into the hands of a complete stranger? The rest of the will was a blur. Gerald concluded his reading with clinical efficiency, closing the folder and offering his usual hollow condolences before leaving us to our growing hysteria. The moment the doors closed behind him, chaos erupted. My uncles shouted over each other, demanding private investigators, forensic audits, and immediate legal action. My cousins whispered in corners, speculating wildly about affairs, hidden children, or secret criminal ties. My mother sobbed quietly, while my father paced the room like a trapped animal. And through it all, one single question pulsed like a heartbeat in my head. Who was Evelyn Harper? That night I couldn't sleep. My mind played and replayed every moment from the reading of the will, every shocked expression, every whispered accusation. The image of my grandfather, the man who shaped my life, who stood like a giant at every family gathering, began to fracture in my mind. The man I thought I knew had built an entire world in silence, one I never suspected. I sat alone in my room, staring at the scattered financial statements Gerald had provided after the reading. The documents were all perfectly legal. The transfers to Evelyn Harper were meticulously documented, signed by my grandfather, and initiated, with unwavering intention over more than a decade. Offshore accounts, property titles, anonymous shell corporations. He hadn't made these moves hastily. He had planned every detail with care, precision, and secrecy. And that terrified me even more. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a long-term decision. Deliberate, thoughtful, and hidden from every one of us. At sunrise, my phone buzzed. It was my uncle, already awake, his voice sharp. "We need to meet. Today." I joined the family council in my grandfather's office once again. This time the tension was electric. My uncles had already hired private investigators. They demanded Gerald release additional files, hoping to find inconsistencies they could use to challenge the transfers. She had to be blackmailing him, my uncle insisted. He wouldn't give her this money willingly. He was manipulated, my cousin added. She took advantage of him in his old age. My father sat silently, his eyes distant. My mother wiped tears from her face, unable to speak, but I couldn't stay quiet any longer. "We don't know that," I said softly, my voice cutting through the noise. "We don't know anything yet." My uncle glared at me. "Don't be naive, Nathan. This is theft, plain and simple. If we don't act quickly, that woman will walk away with our family's legacy." I looked at him, my stomach churning. Is that what this is about? The money? Or the fact that he trusted someone outside this family more than us? The room went still. My uncle's face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare question our loyalty. We dedicated our lives to him. She's an outsider. She manipulated him." "Or maybe," I replied calmly, "she was simply there when he needed someone to trust, and none of us ever noticed he needed help." The argument raged for hours. Legal options were discussed, strategies were proposed, lawsuits were prepared. But amidst all the shouting and accusations, no one stopped to ask the question that haunted me. What had driven my grandfather to make this choice? Why hadn't he confided in us? Why had he trusted a stranger more than his own blood? And what had happened all those years ago that planted the first seeds of this secret life? By the end of the week, the private investigators delivered their first report. A thick envelope was dropped on the dining room table, its weight heavier than the paper it carried. My uncles tore it open eagerly, their eyes scanning every page with desperate intensity. "There's nothing here," one of them shouted in frustration. No criminal record, no history of lawsuits, no debts, no connection to any of his businesses. The reports confirmed that Evelyn Harper was, by all public accounts, an ordinary woman. She lived in a modest two-bedroom house in a quiet suburb. She had worked for nearly 30 years as a financial advisor for small independent clients before retiring early. She paid her taxes on time. She volunteered at a local library. She wasn't wealthy before meeting my grandfather. She wasn't famous. She wasn't involved in any known scandal. She was invisible, and that only made my family more furious. "She's clever," my aunt hissed. "She covered her tracks. That's why we can't find anything." My father finally spoke, his voice low and defeated. "Or maybe she really is who she appears to be." His words hung in the air like a lead weight. It was the first time anyone in the room dared to suggest that perhaps there wasn't some grand conspiracy at play. But my uncles wouldn't hear it. "We need to meet her face to face," my uncle said sharply. "She'll slip up when she has to explain herself directly." Against my better judgment, I agreed to go. Part of me still needed to see this woman with my own eyes to understand what kind of power she could have held over a man like my grandfather. We arranged the meeting through her attorney. She agreed, surprisingly without resistance. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of her home. The house was even smaller than I imagined. Well-maintained but modest. No signs of luxury or extravagance despite the fortune now legally hers. The door opened before I could knock, and there she was, Evelyn Harper. She was older than I expected, perhaps in her late 60s. Her silver hair was tied back neatly. She wore a simple cardigan and slacks, nothing ostentatious. Her face carried lines of age, but her eyes were soft and remarkably steady. She looked directly at me with a calm that unnerved me. "Nathan," she said gently, as if greeting an old acquaintance rather than the grandson of the man whose empire she had inherited. I swallowed hard. "How do you know my name?" "Because your grandfather spoke of you often." Her words hit like a soft hammer, disarming me completely. She stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The interior of her home was warm, filled with books, plants, and photographs of people I didn't recognize. Family members, perhaps. But none of them were my grandfather. There were no grand oil paintings, no marble statues, no signs of the fortune she now controlled. We sat across from each other in her small living room. She offered me tea, which I declined, my stomach twisting too tightly for comfort. For a long moment, we sat in silence. I studied her, searching for cracks in her composure, for any sign of guilt or manipulation. But there was none. "Why?" I finally asked. My voice was quieter than I intended. "Why would he give you everything?" She sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "Because I saved him when no one else knew he was drowning." My breath caught in my throat. Saved? Him from what? She looked at me with a sadness that felt impossibly deep. From himself. The words hung in the air like a confession neither of us could fully escape. From himself. I leaned forward, my voice trembling. "What does that mean?" Evelyn's eyes glistened, though her voice remained calm. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man, Nathan. Driven, ambitious, ruthless when he had to be. But even brilliant men can break. Long before his empire grew into what it became, he made decisions, risky ones, that nearly destroyed everything. Bad partnerships, dangerous loans, deals built on promises that collapsed beneath him." She paused, as if weighing how much truth I was ready to hear. "He was drowning in debt. Debts no one in your family ever knew existed. He hid it all from you, from your father, from everyone. The shame consumed him. The pressure to remain the strong patriarch forced him into isolation, and by the time I met him, he was weeks away from losing it all. My mouth went dry. The man I had worshipped as invincible had nearly lost everything. He couldn't turn to your family, she continued, her voice gentle but firm. He couldn't bear the thought of disappointing you all. You placed him so high on a pedestal, Nathan, that he was terrified of falling. He needed someone who saw him not as a god, but as a man. I struggled to process the weight of her words. How did you meet him? By accident, really. She smiled faintly. I was working as a financial advisor for small private clients. He walked into my office one afternoon, not as Mr. Whitmore, the empire builder, but as a desperate man with nowhere else to turn. He didn't want handouts. He didn't even ask for sympathy. He just needed guidance, a path to stabilize the chaos he had created. My head spun. None of this matched the image of my grandfather I had grown up with. So you helped him? Yes, she nodded. I created new strategies, restructured debts, negotiated quietly with lenders. Over time, he began to rebuild what he had nearly lost. He paid back every dollar he owed, including the small loan I personally extended to him in those early days. And yet, even after he was back on stable ground, the guilt never left him. In his mind, his second chance was because of me. And as the years passed, his gratitude became obsession. My stomach twisted. Obsession, not romantic, she clarified quickly. Never romantic, but emotional. He couldn't forgive himself for nearly destroying everything. And because he couldn't forgive himself, he tried to repay me over and over again. Each new investment he made under my guidance, every property he acquired, he quietly funneled a portion into private trusts under my name. He insisted it was only fair. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend it. But you didn't stop him? I tried, Nathan, many times. But he was a man who needed to feel in control of his redemption. Refusing him would have only deepened his shame. It was never about greed for me. I never needed his money. I lived comfortably on my own. But he was relentless. She looked down, her voice thick with regret. Your grandfather was brilliant, but deeply wounded. The more he gave, the more he convinced himself he was restoring some moral balance. And I allowed it. Not for the money, but because I saw how desperately he needed to believe he was atoning for his mistakes. Silence filled the room. Again. My heart pounded in my chest as the weight of this secret unfolded fully in front of me. My grandfather hadn't been robbed or blackmailed. He had voluntarily created this secret life of restitution, not because he was weak, but because he was broken in ways none of us ever saw. Why didn't he tell us? I whispered. Evelyn's eyes softened. Because he loved you too much to risk your image of him. And because he didn't trust that your family would understand his failures. When I returned home that evening, my head swirled with everything Evelyn had revealed. But as heavy as the truth was, I knew something. Even heavier awaited me, telling my family. I gathered my parents and my uncles at my grandfather's estate, the place where for decades we had celebrated countless milestones beneath his watchful portrait. That portrait now seemed to glare down on us like a ghost. I recounted everything Evelyn had shared, the financial collapse, the secret redemption, the quiet rebuilding, the fragile man hiding beneath the titan they had worshipped. I explained how every transfer was voluntary, how she had tried to refuse, how the fortune was not stolen, but freely given. For several long moments they sat in stunned silence. But I could already see the rage flickering beneath their forced composure. My uncle exploded first. "She's lying!" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "She's manipulating you now, just like she manipulated him." "No," I said firmly. "You're wrong. She never asked for anything. She kept his secret because he begged her to." My cousin leaned forward, his voice cold. "She saw an opportunity." She wrapped herself around his shame and fed off it for years. "That's not what happened," I argued. "You didn't see him then. You only saw the version of him he wanted you to see." My aunt's voice cracked, filled with bitter grief. We were his family. He should have come to us. And what would you have done? I snapped, my patience breaking. Would you have forgiven him, accepted his failures? Or would you have done exactly what you're doing now, trying to control his legacy like vultures? The room went silent, but their burning eyes said everything. My father, still quieter than the rest, finally spoke, his voice hollow. He should have trusted us. I looked at him with sorrow. He didn't know how. You all worshipped him like a god. But he was only a man. And then my uncles turned fully to the path I feared most. We're filing a lawsuit, one of them announced coldly. We'll challenge the trust, claim elder abuse, manipulation. She won't get away with this. My mother gasped, but said nothing. My stomach dropped. You'll lose, I warned. The documents are airtight. The transfers were legal. The court will see the truth. We'll drag her through the mud if we have to, my cousin shouted. If the law won't help us, public opinion will. Let's see how she handles being called a predator in every newspaper in the country. The room transformed into a war council. They strategized media leaks, coordinated with aggressive attorneys, and prepared to launch a public assault that would paint Evelyn as a parasitic fraud. And the more they plotted, the more disgusted I became. I stood, shaking with rage. You're not doing this because he was wronged. You're doing this because you can't stand that he trusted someone else more than you. My uncle pointed a trembling finger at me. You're either with this family, Nathan, or you're against us. I looked around at the faces I had known my entire life. Faces now twisted with greed, betrayal, and wounded pride. Then I guess I'm against you, I said quietly, because I refused to destroy the one person who actually saved him. And with that, I walked out, slamming the heavy oak doors behind me. But even as the doors closed, I knew this was only the beginning. My family's greed wasn't going to fade. They would unleash everything they had to reclaim what they believed was theirs, and Evelyn would be their target. The media storm hit fast and viciously. Within days of my family filing the lawsuit, headlines erupted across every major outlet. Family empire torn apart by mysterious beneficiary. Stranger walks away with patriarch's hidden fortune. Secret mistress or master manipulator? The Evelyn Harper scandal. Photographers camped outside Evelyn's modest home. News vans parked along her quiet street, turning her peaceful neighborhood into a feeding ground for gossip-hungry spectators. Online forums exploded with wild theories, some calling her a brilliant con artist, others painting my grandfather as a lonely old fool. The narrative my family spun took on a life of its own. And through it all, Evelyn remained silent. She refused interviews. She issued no public statements. She simply stayed inside, drawing the blinds as the world outside consumed her story, like a grotesque spectacle. I visited her several times during those weeks, entering through the back alley to avoid the flashing cameras. Each time I found her calm, composed, but with a growing weariness etched into her eyes. You don't deserve this, I told her one evening as we sat in her darkened living room, the distant hum of news vans still audible outside. She smiled faintly. Neither did your grandfather, Nathan. But sometimes the cost of truth is heavier than the lie ever was. My stomach twisted at her quiet strength. She had no reason to endure this. She could have fled, cashed out, disappeared into some distant corner of the world. But she stayed. She faced the storm with a dignity that only made my family's attacks seem more desperate and pathetic. As the lawsuit progressed, both legal teams escalated their tactics. My uncles hired aggressive attorneys who specialized in high-profile estate challenges. They combed through every detail of my grandfather's life, searching for any sliver of evidence they could twist into a narrative of coercion and fraud. Old employees were dragged into depositions. Business partners were interrogated about my grandfather's mental state in his final years. Psychologists were brought in to speculate, without ever having met him, that perhaps cognitive decline had impaired his judgment. Evelyn's legal team, in contrast, remained calm and methodical. They presented every transfer document, every signed agreement, every voluntary declaration my grandfather had made. The paperwork was flawless. Every transaction was executed legally, with full transparency on paper. except that no one outside Evelyn had known it existed. And that secrecy became the weapon my family wielded most. If it was legitimate, why hide it from us? My uncle's attorney argued. Only predators operate in secrecy. My own testimony was requested. Sitting under oath in that sterile courtroom, I faced both sides, my family's cold stares on one side, Evelyn's quiet gaze on the other. Did your grandfather ever express doubts about his decisions? The opposing counsel asked sharply. No, I answered confidently. He never once suggested he was being pressured. Do you expect this court to believe, the attorney continued, his tone dripping with condescension, that a man of his stature, with a family empire to protect, would willingly give away nearly $90 million without any manipulation? I held his gaze firmly. Yes, because that's exactly what happened. You see a man losing control. I see a man trying to redeem himself in the only way he knew how. You see greed. I see guilt. You see manipulation. I see mercy. The courtroom fell silent. The judge's eyes studied me closely, as if weighing my words against the mountain of accusations swirling around us. The trial stretched for weeks. Every day was a brutal display of pride, resentment, and desperation. My family's attorneys painted Evelyn as a master manipulator who preyed on my grandfather's insecurities. Evelyn's team responded with meticulous records, undeniable evidence, and testimony after testimony that supported my grandfather's mental competence. Outside the courtroom, my family's public campaign continued. They leaked private family photographs, personal letters, anything they could spin into a weapon against Evelyn. And yet, through all of it, she remained silent. Aren't you angry? I asked her one night, sitting once again in her small, dark living room. She shook her head. Anger is a luxury I can't afford, Nathan. If I let it consume me, I become like them. Her quiet resilience only deepened my respect for her. I couldn't help but wonder if my grandfather had felt the same, if this was what drew him to her in his darkest hour. Her capacity for grace under unbearable weight. As the trial wore on, the weight of my family's obsession grew unbearable. My uncles grew more desperate with each failed attempt to dismantle Evelyn's defense. Every door they tried to pry open led them back to the same reality. My grandfather had made these decisions of his own free will. There were no secret threats, no hidden recordings, no offshore schemes waiting to be unearthed. Just shame, just guilt, just a man trying to repair something none of us knew was broken. And yet, they couldn't stop. Because to admit that would mean admitting their own blindness. To accept that he had trusted someone else was, to them, a far greater betrayal than the loss of money. The final week of the trial arrived like a heavy storm cloud settling over us. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Journalists speculated daily about the judge's upcoming ruling. Commentators debated Evelyn's morality as though her entire character could be summed up by the fortune attached to her name. Every time I saw her face on television, always accompanied by headlines like "Mysterious Mistress of a Billionaire," my stomach turned. She never once stepped in front of a camera, never once issued a public defense. She endured it all in silence, the same way she had carried my grandfather's shame for decades. As closing arguments began, I sat in the courtroom, exhausted, emotionally hollow, yet unwilling to look away. The prosecution's final statement was venomous. Your Honor, the lead attorney began, pacing dramatically before the bench. We are not merely discussing finances. We are discussing a man's legacy, a legacy built for his children, his grandchildren, his bloodline. And now, because of the cunning manipulation of one woman, that legacy stands on the brink of destruction. The secrecy of these transfers, the calculated isolation from his family, the systematic funneling of wealth to this woman, all point to psychological coercion, whether intentional or not. He paused for effect. We are not claiming she threatened him with violence or blackmail. No, Your Honor, her weapon was far more insidious: emotional dependency. She offered him refuge, comfort, and in doing so positioned herself as his sole redeemer. This, Your Honor, is elder manipulation at its most sophisticated. My family nodded along like a choir of self-righteous saints. The judge scribbled notes, his expression unreadable. Then it was Evelyn's turn. Her attorney stood, his voice calm, deliberate, lacking the theatrics of the prosecution. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about manipulation. It is not about scandal. It is about freedom of choice. A man who carried deep shame, who could not bring himself to burden his family with his failures, found solace in a friendship that offered him a path to redemption. My client never asked for his wealth. She never demanded favors. Every transfer was his decision, executed legally, voluntarily, and with full knowledge of its implications." He stepped closer to the bench, lowering his voice. "If we punish a man for seeking comfort outside his family during moments of personal failure, then we punish every one of us who has ever sought kindness from a stranger when those closest to us could not understand our pain." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "This isn't about greed, Your Honor. It's about grace." The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned back, his eyes scanning the crowded room filled with reporters, attorneys, and a family ripped apart by pride. I looked across the room at Evelyn. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her face calm but pale. She never once looked victorious. She looked tired, worn, as though she had been carrying not only my grandfather's shame, but now my family's rage as well. My own father refused to meet my eyes. My uncles sat stiffly, gripping their attorney's shoulders as though victory was already theirs. But deep inside, I saw it. The flicker of fear. The faint realization that their entire narrative might collapse. The judge stood. "I will review both closing arguments and deliver my ruling within the next 72 hours, he announced. The gavel struck, and the courtroom emptied like a bursting dam. Outside, reporters swarmed. Microphones were shoved in faces, cameras flashing relentlessly. My family's attorneys offered carefully rehearsed sound bites, spinning the narrative. They had carefully curated for weeks. Evelyn, as always, said nothing. She simply walked calmly to her waiting car, disappearing into the chaos as though she were invisible, and now all that remained was the waiting, the final breath before judgment. But I already knew the truth. No matter what the judge ruled, something inside this family was already broken beyond repair. The morning of the verdict arrived under a heavy gray sky. The courthouse steps were already crowded long before the doors opened. Reporters jostled for space, camera flashes burst like fireworks, and television anchors rehearsed their breathless summaries for the evening news. But inside the courtroom, everything was still. Heavy, unforgiving. My family sat clustered together like soldiers preparing for battle. Their attorneys whispered last-minute strategies, though everyone knew there was nothing left to argue. Across the aisle, Evelyn sat alone. She wore the same simple gray suit she had worn throughout the trial. Her hands rested gently on her lap, her fingers interlaced. She did not look afraid. She looked resigned. The judge entered, and everyone rose. His face remained as unreadable as it had been from the very first day of this trial. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at his notes, and began. "This court has reviewed extensive testimony, financial documentation, expert analysis, and legal argumentation presented by both parties over the course of these proceedings." The room was silent, save for the sound of pens scratching on notepads as reporters scrambled to capture every word. At the heart of this case lies not merely financial transfers, but questions of influence, vulnerability, and intent. The plaintiffs have argued that Ms. Harper exerted psychological coercion over Mr. Whitmore, thereby manipulating him into redirecting substantial portions of his personal wealth into her care. My uncle leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. The judge continued. "However, after careful review, the court finds insufficient evidence to support these claims. While Mr. Whitmore did conceal these transactions from his family, there is no credible proof that these actions were taken under duress, manipulation, or cognitive decline." My mother gasped softly. My father exhaled as though punched in the gut. The judge's voice remained steady, merciless. The legal documents presented are thorough, properly executed, and unambiguous in their intent. The financial transfers were deliberate, consistent, and performed over an extended period of time, suggesting calculated decision-making rather than impulsive vulnerability. He paused for a long moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Therefore, this court upholds the validity of the trust as it stands. The assets in question shall remain under the full legal control of Ms. Harper. The petition to reverse the transfers is denied. The gavel struck. 3 short, heavy knocks that echoed like gunshots in the silent chamber. And just like that, it was over. The reporters exploded into a frenzy, shouting questions across the courtroom. My uncles slumped into their seats, stunned. My cousins stared blankly, mouths slightly open, as if the wind had been knocked out of their chests. My father sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench as though unable to process what had just happened. Evelyn did not react. No fist pump, no sigh of relief. She simply lowered her head and whispered something I couldn't hear. A prayer, perhaps, or simply a breath released after years of silent endurance. As the courtroom emptied into chaos, I approached her quietly. "It's done," I whispered. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening but calm. "No," she said softly. "It will never be done, Nathan. They'll carry this anger for the rest of their lives." "And you?" I asked. She smiled gently. "I'll live quietly, as I always have. I never wanted his money, only his peace." Her words landed like a final stone in my chest. For all the noise, for all the spectacle my family created, Evelyn never once lost sight of the simple truth my grandfather could never speak aloud. He had failed. And in his failure, he found someone willing to carry the part of him he couldn't show to those who worshipped him as perfect. As the crowd outside swirled around us, I escorted her quietly to her car. We said nothing more. There were no victorious speeches, no celebrations, only the soft closing of a door and the slow pull of the car disappearing into the city beyond. In the weeks that followed, the dust settled, but the wounds remained raw. My uncles retreated into a bitter silence, nursing their defeat like a festering wound they could never fully heal. They refused interviews now, having exhausted their narrative in the public eye. Their pride was shattered, not because of the money lost, but because of the humiliation they could no longer control. My father withdrew even further. The man who once stood so proudly beside my grandfather's empire now wandered through the empty halls of the estate, as if haunted by ghosts. I visited him often, hoping to bridge the distance, but each conversation was thinner than the last, polite but hollow, as though a part of him had evaporated. My mother tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but even she struggled beneath the weight of the family's collapse. Family gatherings became sparse. Holidays passed with empty chairs and cold glances. The Grand Whitmore dynasty, once a fortress of unity, now stood fractured. Not because of Evelyn, but because of our own inability to see my grandfather as anything other than a flawless idol. And yet, amidst that ruin, there was clarity. I visited Evelyn one final time before she quietly left town. We sat on her porch, watching the last golden light of evening fade behind the trees. She had sold her house, donated much of the fortune to charitable causes my grandfather had once admired but never truly supported. Scholarships for struggling students, programs for small businesses, shelters for those who had fallen into the same financial despair my grandfather once feared. "You could have kept it all," I said softly. She smiled, her gaze distant. "And what would I have gained, Nathan? Wealth doesn't fill the space where regret lives." I studied her, still in awe of her grace. "Do you hate them?" I asked. She shook her head gently. "No, they're angry because they loved him. But they never allowed him to be weak. They never made room for his humanity. They worshipped the myth he created because it made them feel safe. And when that myth shattered, so did they." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "He should have trusted us." "He tried," she whispered, "in his way. But sometimes, the people closest to us are the hardest to confide in. We expect perfection from them, and they fear becoming disappointments. She turned to me then, her eyes soft but unwavering. "You're the only one who saw him fully, Nathan. You saw both his greatness and his brokenness, and you didn't turn away." I looked down, feeling the weight of that truth settle inside me. For years, I had adored my grandfather without ever knowing him, and now, long after his death, I finally understood who he really was. A man shaped by brilliance and fear, success and shame, love and deep loneliness. As the last sliver of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, I whispered, "Do you think he's at peace now?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I hope so. And perhaps now you can find your own peace, too." The next morning, she was gone. No press conference, no farewell letter, just silence. The house stood empty, her chapter closed, and as I stood before my grandfather's grave one final time, the wind whispering through the trees, I traced my fingers along his name etched into cold stone. "I forgive you," I whispered, "for everything you couldn't say." In that moment, I realized something profound. Legacy isn't built on the perfection we project to the world. It's built on the truths we leave behind, messy, painful, complicated truths that force those we leave behind to face themselves. And as I walked away from the grave, I felt lighter. The weight of his secrets was no longer mine to carry. Only the lesson remained. Sometimes family isn't about who inherits the wealth, but who inherits the understanding. And understanding I had finally earned.